Well, first of all, welcome everybody to this webinar. Before we get started, just a few logistical matters. This call is being recorded and will be shared on the event page on the Investor Alliance for Human Rights website, as well as our YouTube channel. We'll also be sharing it out with all of you who've registered. Also, I should note you'll find on our event webpage and our YouTube channel a very useful additional resource, and that is a video log that Joanne Bauer at Rights Collab has recorded for us, which looks at the process of stakeholder engagement throughout human rights due diligence. You are off camera and on mute. We do have time allotted at the end for a Q&A session. If you do have questions, feel free though to put them into the Q&A function at any time during the speakers' presentations. If possible, they'll try to answer them. Otherwise, we'll try to address those questions during the discussion. Please do not use the chat function, however, because that chat function has been disabled. So, Monica, if you could advance the slide. So we have three wonderful and very experienced speakers here today. I unfortunately do not have time to read their extensive bios, but we'll be hearing today from Danielle Essink, who is an engagement specialist at Robeco. We'll hear from Michelle Langlois, who's a senior advisor at Shift, and from Julie Vallat, who is VP for Human Rights at L'Oreal. If we go on to the next slide, the agenda, just briefly what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start off with giving some context to the CR2R webinar series and recap briefly what we're looking at in terms of provisions in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights around expectations of companies to communicate their efforts to address human rights harms to stakeholders and rights holders. Then we're going to turn things over to Michelle, and she's going to highlight some of the drivers behind better human rights reporting, both in terms of evolving soft law standards and mandated disclosures. She will explore key elements of effective human rights reporting and disclosures by companies, as well as sharing her perspective on what is being done well and what can be improved upon. And finally, she's going to touch a bit upon how stakeholders should be meaningfully engaged throughout the reporting and communication process, as well as some of her views on the best form and approaches to such communications with stakeholders. Then next, we're going to hear from Julie, who is going to talk to us about L'Oreal's journey in putting out their first human rights report. And actually, Monica, if you could put a link to that report into the chat function. This report was actually developed in conjunction with Shift, and Shift helped in identifying some of the salient human rights risks that are noted in that report. And she's going to discuss some of the drivers behind L'Oreal's disclosures on their human rights performance, as well as addressing some of the challenges in meeting these evolving human rights disclosure expectations and requirements. And finally, she's going to talk to us about how L'Oreal interacted with stakeholders throughout that process. And again, I encourage you to take a look at that report. There's an entire section on stakeholder engagement. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Danielle, and she will talk to us about the current state of affairs around decision-useful human rights data for investors, as well as the type of data she would like to see from her portfolio companies. She will discuss how she communicates Robeco's expectations for reporting and disclosures, as well as where companies have been more and at sometimes less successful in those disclosures. And then we'll have hopefully 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If we go to the next slide, just briefly in terms of the CR2R webinar series, we're currently at the fourth installment of this series. Its purpose is really to systematically explore the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect as framed in the UN Guiding Principles in order to build the capacity and support investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. And this work is done, at least in the Investor Alliance, through a number of coordinated corporate engagements, among them one using the corporate human rights benchmarks data, more on that in a bit here, as well as engagement on digital rights using the Ranking Digital Rights Assessment. Both of them are World Benchmarking Alliance frameworks. We do have a dedicated webpage to the CR2R series, and I very much encourage you to go take a look and see some of those earlier webinars that we have done. All of them recorded with accompanying video logs and additional resources available. If we go to the next slide, Monica. So what are we honing in on today? We're going to hone in on the idea that companies have a responsibility to communicate the efforts that they're taking to address their human rights impacts. This is what's often referred to for short as know and show, right? Important is also the showing vis-a-vis impacted stakeholders and rights holders. The guiding principles establish that communications can take many forms. They can be standalone human rights reports, much like the one that L'Oreal just put out, or sustainability reports and other non-financial disclosures. But very importantly, formal human rights reporting is required when operations or operating contexts pose significant or severe human rights risks and impacts. The communication should be frequent, accessible, and relevant to the intended audience, and certainly accessible to affected stakeholders and rights holders. And the information provided by companies should be sufficient to allow who's ever reading that report or digesting that information to evaluate the adequacy of human rights impacts. Maybe just two other things to note, also mentioned in the guiding principles. Very important is that communications do not potentially pose a risk to affected stakeholders, and that if possible, companies should consider independent verification because that can certainly strengthen the quality of the content of reporting as well as perceptions around the credibility of the reporting. As we go to the next slide, just briefly, as I mentioned, these webinar series are certainly very supportive of our coordinated corporate engagement using the corporate human rights benchmark data. The purpose of the CHRB is to drive corporate accountability and create a pathway for better human rights practices by examining the extent to which companies actually implement the requirements of the UN guiding principles. It focuses on 5 high-risk sectors. Those are apparel, extractives, food and agriculture, automotive, and technological manufacturing. I don't want to go too deep in this methodology, couldn't even possibly do it in one webinar if I wanted to, but it covers down on 5 themes, which again mirror that corporate responsibility to respect, as well as the steps in the due diligence process. You see the 5 areas here on the slide. In particular, we're going to be focusing in on UNGP 21, and you'll see there are a number of indicators in the corporate human rights benchmark that examine efforts of companies to communicate how they're addressing their human rights impacts, as well as their efforts to effectively engage with stakeholders, not only in terms of the communications they're undertaking, but also throughout the steps of that due diligence process. So I encourage all of you to take a look at that CHRB methodology, because whether or not you're involved in our coordinated corporate engagement, and you are welcome to join if you are interested, just reach out to me. These indicators are very useful for assessing any company's performance on human rights vis-a-vis the expectations laid out in the guiding principles. So with that brief introduction, I am going to now hand it over to Michelle to take from here. Thanks so much, Michelle, for joining today.
Hi, thanks, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here. So today I'm here to speak specifically about the show in Know and Show. So really about communicating with stakeholders, whether they are affected stakeholders or users of disclosure information. As Rebecca mentioned, I work with Shift. I'm a senior advisor, and I have the chance to work across our 3 strategic pillars at Shift. So working first in business engagement, so really advising companies on all matters of implementation of the guiding principles on business and human rights. And I would say that my focus has really been over the last 10 years on communication, on reporting specifically, especially at the time when about 10 years ago, companies were just starting to report on human rights. They were very early stage. And so at the time, we released the UNGP reporting framework to translate the UNGPs into a set of concise questions that companies could use to report against their progress to respect human rights. So I'm just going to pull up my slides now and put them full screen. Can you give me, Rebecca, that's still...
Thumbs up, we can see it.
Okay,
Great.
super. Super. So just in terms of the drivers for human rights reporting, which is the first topic that I was asked to speak about, the very early days, so predating the guiding principles on business and human rights and their integration in the OECD guidelines, companies started to report on CSR, so really focusing more on sort of philanthropic types of activities of supporting communities, of starting to look at impacts, but often from a lens of risk to the business, or either, again, purely philanthropic, where it would be to support good causes or build wells in Africa, sort of separate from how they would manage risk to people. But still, it started to build this idea that you could look beyond risk to the business to for the greater good. Then came the UNGPs in 2011 to 2008 for the sort of the early the three pillars. For those of you who are familiar of the state responsibility to protect, the corporate responsibility to respect, and the shared duty to ensure that that there is remedy for those affected. So the guiding principles came, now over 13 years ago, and really set the expectations for what businesses should be doing when it comes to human rights. Because before that, there was this really lack of clarity around how this responsibility should be split. And there was this idea that, of the sphere of influence, that you should start to, to target, to care about those who are closest to you, where you have influence. And then, the further you get away from your influence, then where you kind of stop, your responsibility stops. And the UNGPs were very clear that that's not the way to go, that we should focus on severity of impacts first. And so part of that is what we see here is the due diligence wheel. I'm sure at this stage you're familiar with this due diligence wheel, and we see communicating as a big part of what it looks like to do proper due diligence. So in the UNGPs, we have this clarity that, as you mentioned, Rebecca, that there's a need to provide sufficient information to evaluate the adequacy of an enterprise's response. And I think even to this day, that is really the, what centers, what are all everything that we look for in reporting, to make sure that the information that is shared is sufficient for us to understand what the company is actually doing, rather than sort of high level information that doesn't tell you what the risk is and how the company is really handling it in practice. Then from the UNGPs in 2011, a big change for business and human rights, finally clarity, this shared understanding of what human rights due diligence should look like by governments, by businesses, by civil society, but still lack of clarity about, what is it, this step of communicating on human rights. So the UNGP reporting framework really, as I mentioned, created these 31 questions that are not only there to tell you what is relevant to disclose, but also really key to understanding possible gaps internally. By asking yourself the right questions, it really helps you understand what you are doing and what perhaps you are missing. And so we see here this quote from John Ruggie, the author of the Guiding Principles, at the time when we released the reporting framework, where for him, the reporting framework really put the corporate responsibility to respect into everyday language, set of smart questions, but really, that those questions that any company should need to have answers internally. So for us to know internally that we are indeed managing, that there are no gaps that we should address, but also externally, that's the kind of information that that is relevant for people to know about. And I think even to this day, everything that we do at Shift when it comes to reporting is to ensure that the information that is shared is relevant. The last thing we want to do, and that was the sort of really the driving idea behind the reporting framework, was to make sure that that reporting would be feasible and meaningful. So feasible because companies wanted, they say, well, we can't report on everything. This needs to be manageable. So we were really keen to make sure that whatever was requested from companies was reasonable, was feasible, and then also meaningful, because then NGOs wanted to know everything, and that was not, that wasn't feasible. And also, a lot of the information would not be meaningful. You don't need to know everything about what a company is doing, but there are certain things that really matter. So we came to this conclusion around the questions of the reporting framework of feasibility and meaningfulness. And that's what we continue to do now that we work not only on business engagement, and I realized that I forgot to mention the other pillar, really on standard setting and financial institutions. So to build this environment where respect for human rights is central to how company run their businesses, of course, in addition to everything they do, but that the focus is on what matters most. So then where we are today, so we have the sort of this early days of CSR, we have international standards that tell you what to report, and then we come to the cascade of legislation that we have today. Prominently, we have the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, accompanied by now the EU Corporate Due Diligence Directive, that are really sort of these overarching pieces of legislation that are fully aligned, or mainly aligned with the guiding principles, really turning into hard law those previous voluntary international standards. So now I'm not going to go into details on the evolving landscape here because there's a lot to say and I'm happy to answer questions after. But the point is that there are developments not just in Europe, but also elsewhere in North America, in Asia as well. And I think the best way to summarize all of this is in these three buckets of legislative developments. So the first one is the one that we, perhaps is not more interesting today, but the focus, which is really those reporting requirements. We have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that I just mentioned, all the modern slavery acts that require companies to report on forced labor, child labor risks in the UK, in Australia, elsewhere. We have now in Canada as well, the SFDR with some metrics, some data points around human rights issues. Then we have the second bucket of due diligence. And here it's not about reporting what a company is doing, because technically you could report that you're doing nothing and you would comply with the regulation. But for the second bucket, it's really about the substantive requirement to conduct due diligence. And here, of course, we have the French duty of vigilance law that definitely is I'm certain actually that Julie will say that was a driver for L'Oréal's reporting. But also then the German supply chain law, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that just came out. So really this requirement to conduct due diligence, which in most cases sort of substantially aligns with the international standards, the guiding principles. And then this third bucket of import bans. So this one is not to say that it's sort of separate from due diligence, but it cares about the outcomes. So if a product is, of course, connected to forced labor, child labor, in the case of the US legislation and EU legislation as well, then you would remove a product. So the only way to defend yourself against this is to provide evidence that you have conducted proper due diligence. So all of those have some kind of reporting elements to them, but really the focus here is on the CSRD and those other pieces. So now, how are these standards aligned? I think there's a lot of criticism against, the growing legislative landscape. I think the good news is that there is increasing alignment. At Shift, it is core to our mission to make sure that whatever new legislation is out there that touches on risk to people, on social impacts, really is aligned with the guiding principles. So we're really glad to see that actually that strategy plus a strategy of our peers is really working. We are going towards better alignment. And one of the ways that this is happening is through the criteria that is now embedded into legislation on how to prioritize what to report on and what to focus due diligence. So the criteria here that you might be familiar with, that the UNGPs use to prioritize impacts on severity, so using scale, sort of gravity of impacts, scope, remediability, and also the likelihood. Those criteria have now been integrated into legislation, and that is precisely what the European reporting directive is asking. So saying that when you look at double materialities, specifically at the impact materiality side, so how you can impact on people and the environment, these are the criteria. So really taking the international standard and then using them into legislation. And the same criteria is also used in the due diligence directive. So really this great alignment flowing from the UNGPs all the way through to 2024 and beyond in terms of implementation. And we see this also, again, the focus is on CSRD, CSDDD here, because those are the kind of the more overarching pieces of legislation we now have. But we see that the way to prioritize impacts is exactly the same process in both the CSRD and the CSDDD, right? So you understand the broad context, you list your list of potential and actual impacts, kind of like the really long list, and then you focus with your assessment on severity and likelihood of impacts to then come up with your priorities for reporting, which makes it into your financial report, your management report, and then finally also your priorities for action. And those are not, there's no hard threshold. It's where you prioritize and you end up with a set of topics that you invest more resources into, but still that you might address over time, right? Rather than saying we report on this and then we don't. So slightly different objectives, but complete same process throughout. So now, what are good indicators for human rights reporting? What do we look like? So first thing would be those specific, sort of really substantive points. The first thing is the company identifying its most severe impacts on people, right? So those can be called salient human rights issues for companies that are aware of the UNGPs and have used that methodology to prioritize. They can also be called material impacts because the methodology is the same, as I said, right, to look at severity and likelihood. So the point is, are they identifying those most severe impacts on people, clarifying that they have indeed looked at the lens of risk to people and not risk to the business, right? That is the distinction for human rights reporting. The second point is the full value chain approach. And that is, I think, one of the biggest red flag that we're seeing right now with companies that are undertaking double materiality assessments is, despite the fact that the legislation is very clear, specifically the CSRD, to look at the full value chain, so own operations plus everything that the company can be connected to identify impacts. And I think many are not getting this right. They're still focusing on what's closest to them. So like going back to the sphere of influence days prior to the UNGPs, where they go for what's closest, what's easiest, right? Their own workforce and perhaps even their customers, but not going beyond that. And also looking at all potentially affected stakeholders. There's this, I think many are not comfortable or used to the idea of thinking about risk to communities or risk to workers in the value chain, but it does go all the way there. So I think in reporting, we do look for that evidence that they are considering risk beyond, again, their own workforce or those stakeholders that are closest to their operations. We also want disclosure to be quite specific in pinpointing the impact. We want to know, so it's not just, it's not enough to say, well, we are connected to risk to of forced labor or child labor. And so it needs to be specific. Where, what kind of impacts are we talking about? Which business partner or what part of of the business is affected by this? We do want to understand, and the disclosure needs to be specific about this. And not only is this a wish from civil society and other stakeholders, it's also a requirement now, including in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, to really be clear about what the risk is. And of course, for investors and others, it's also key information. To not confuse prioritization and action. So that's I would say this with the full value chain approach are really the biggest red flags. Too many are confusing prioritizing. So they're looking at how you can be connected to impacts and what you do about it. So of course, how you're connected to impacts is looking at everything, full value chain. And of course, you could say, well, we have very little to do with impacts of informal waste pickers, let's say, in terms of like recycling, but it's part of your value chain. What you can do about it might be very little. Still, you are connected to it. So in terms of prioritizing impacts for reporting, you need to focus there. Then what you do about it depends on whether you are causing, contributing, or you're simply linked to the impact. So it's really two things. You can still prioritize for reporting and say, well, in terms of action, we are going to use our leverage, which is quite limited, to collaborate with others, to join an alliance that looks at these topics. We're going to try to engage stakeholders to understand more about what we do, but it's different from how you prioritize, because too many are prioritizing things that are causing or contributing and leaving outside linkage impacts. So just going to jump quickly here, I think explaining what actions were taken is also a big gap right now. So many are kind of investing in assessing risk and going, to be honest, way beyond expectations in terms of data-driven approaches, spending a lot of money into specific solutions to track their supply chains. There's very little evidence right now that these are effective. So instead of sort of getting paralysis by analysis of wanting to assess forever and be certain about the risk, there's a really important move that needs to be made to tackling those impacts. And I'm certain that civil society would be very supportive of that, of it's not enough to just kind of be certain about your impacts, you also need to do something about it. And that's where we're not seeing enough of those sort of meaningful actions being taken beyond just flagging that we are aware of the risk, and maybe joining sort of a business association, a very high level, to try to better understand the issue. I think people are really pushing to get more granular. And then finally, just cross-cutting points. We're looking for specificity and concrete examples in disclosures. So as I mentioned, right, to pinpointing the impact, you need to be specific, moving away from those statements of sort of more general that would say we conduct due diligence without really explaining what that looks like. And then openness to sharing challenges. And this is really about being candid about the kinds of impacts and what's difficult about managing human rights issues. It's an obligation of conduct, not of result. So we're not looking for perfection, but we are looking to have sort of transparent disclosures from companies to say, well, this area is actually quite challenging. We have very little leverage. It is a severe impact. We need to work with others. We're going to look for ways. We're going to continue working on this, rather than kind of showing that everything is good and the company has everything under control, when we know for a fact that that's not possible even for the companies that have the most resources to spend on this. So really quickly, and I'll move on to my final slide. But what do we mean by stakeholders? So I think we need to be really clear that when we, in a human rights context, speak of stakeholders, we're speaking about the people that can be directly affected. So those are we care about the views of those people first. And then because it's really difficult in many cases to reach to the people that are affected in terms of, being very vulnerable, difficult to access, language barriers, etc. Then after that, we also go to credible proxies. So those people that represent those communities, and then also human rights experts that are not necessarily close to those communities, but can still speak in an informed way about their interest and the kinds of impacts that they are dealing with. The CSRD also is clear about that distinction where you have people that are considered affected and those that are sort of both disclosure stakeholders and both affected sort of employees, trade unions, consumers. And those are usually the ones that you might consult as a business to understand impacts, especially in the context of disclosure. Many companies are covered by disclosure requirements, but not yet by due diligence requirements because of the different scopes of coverage of companies. So if you are a company not covered by the CSDDD on due diligence, but still need to report, those are the stakeholders that you'll focus on. NGOs, topic experts, maybe trade unions, employees, but very rarely would we see them directly engaging with affected stakeholders. And finally, I'm going to keep this as a reference slide and we can come back for those more interested in the CSRD questions. But really, what does meaningful engagement look like? What we want here is to really focus on due diligence and on engagement in the course of due diligence, not just for reporting. Right now, what we're seeing is companies reaching out to stakeholders to say, we have a double materiality assessment. We really need you to validate this with us. And then it's like a 1-hour session where you're presented topics without any context and you're supposed to, provide feedback on this. And then it's like, okay, we have our session validated, our priorities, and, companies go off with this. This is not the way to do it. So really what we want is to start engaging early with NGOs, affected stakeholders in times of peace. Build those relationships, not just when it's time to get validation on the material topics, but before that, to say, well, we have impacts that we've identified that you have expertise in. We would love to have a conversation, exchange. So building that relationship, and not enough companies are doing this. And so we want definitely investors to encourage companies to think about it in this way. to provide feedback loops. Too many times it's like this one-time engagement once a year, and then you know, NGOs don't hear about the company ever again, or following year. That is, again, not the way to do engagement. You want that ongoing feedback where you check in, where you're really being sort of setting this trust and transparency in the process. Sharing information is not a one-way street. So too many times we ask of stakeholders to provide information, and then we're just kind of silently receiving it, and then not be able to really hear what the company is really has to say, what they're dealing with. So be conscious of that exchange of information. Companies need to do their homework before engaging with companies. So don't, you know, companies that show up with like, tell us what the risks are. That's always kind of very frustrating for civil society, for experts to deal with. And then finally, being very cognizant that there's an increasing demand on NGOs because of legislation, right, that requires stakeholder engagement. So many are getting tons of requests, doing this for free. So really being conscious of that, perhaps encourage companies to offer even some kind of money, and that gets tricky in terms of you know, whether that could lead to the party not being independent, but really in practice, that's not really a concern that we see most. If you work with credible NGOs and offer to, you know, make some kind of contribution, for some, it's raised some ethics issues. For many, it hasn't. And I think we're kind of going in that direction, or at least pooling companies together to do stakeholder engagements where they are in similar sectors or activities or regions, so that we can make the most out of those engagement sessions. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That was such rich information. Really appreciate it. I know I have a number of follow-up questions, but just looking at the time, I think we're going to move on and hold those questions off till we get to the Q&A session. So with that, I'm going to hand it over now to Julie. Thanks for being here. I'm going to put the link to L'Oréal's report into the chat function again, so everybody has that. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Rebecca, and hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you. So indeed, as Michelle said, at L'Oréal, we started this journey being subjected to the French vigilance law, because we have operations in many countries all over the world, but as it was reminded, this French law was a kind of first milestone in this reporting journey. So we've been building up at L'Oréal internal committee, you know, with different experts on human rights, but also on sustainable sourcing, on environment, biodiversity, water, health and safety, and many others. And it was very good because to break all the silos, you know, and to put all these people and this collective intelligence together, because together we are stronger to identify risks on a regular basis, and to update, of course, internally and then externally the vigilance plan that has to be disclosed every year. So it was a very good first step and milestone, and yeah, and in terms of governance, but also in terms of ways of working together. And also with external partners, of course, because beyond collecting information from these different métiers, we also consulted different experts, either our partners, different NGOs, or experts we are working with on a regular basis. For example, we are working with SHIFT, as it was said, but also we used to work with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. We are now a member of the Fair Labor Association, etc., tackling human rights issues in the value chain and also in the agricultural sector. So we have different kind of formal partners among the NGO world and the trade unions world, but also informal discussions regularly we have with different stakeholders that we are not in partnership with, like the National Human Rights Institution from different countries, or again local NGOs that raise issues from there or there. So we have different channels also, and it's very useful to identify those risks again, because risks are evolving a lot and moving a lot. You have seen the world is going mad with all these wars. I think for the time being, there are more than 50 countries in violent conflicts, and I'm not talking about those who are affected by the conflicts, you know, with millions of refugees and migrant workers, with inflation, with poverty rising. So, voilà. So if you don't have tools that are dynamic, it's very difficult to identify risk. Again, we are doing, like many companies, social audits. It's a good tool, but we know it's not enough. So it's very important to go beyond and to do human rights impact assessment, but also, as we said, engagement, and again, being aware that these are just tools, and you will never be perfect in identifying the whole picture because of the magnitude also of the issues, and also, as it was said, the value chain is wide. So again, we have to be strategic. So this first French law helped in this direction. And then, of course, we wanted to go beyond because we are committed to respect the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And again, this is going, of course, far beyond the French law scope, because the French law scope is focused on operations and more or less tier 1, tier 2 suppliers. You know, it's relation commerciale établie, a commercial long-lasting relationship. And as you know, based on the directives from the European Commission, both the CSRD but also the CHRB, which is upcoming, they are in line with UNGPs, and meaning that it's the whole value chain which is at stake, of course, on a risk-based approach. Again, you can't address everything. You have, as Michel said, to prioritize based on risk to people, as Michel said, is very right. Companies sometimes tend to forget that, and we forget on risk to business, and we never should forget that's really risk on people. So beyond this French law and all this legislative movement coming on, at L'Oréal, we also wanted to disclose voluntarily some different sustainability progress, you know, either through the UNGP communication on progress or the GRI, or, you know, sustainability reports. At L'Oréal, it used to be named Sharing Beauty with All. So we had different kind of approach, and more or less referenced, you know, in the voluntary reporting, you know, through our universal registration document. But still, it can be a bit technical, more and more complex, sometimes long. So we have to find a balance also to be understood by non-experts, understood by non-experts, but also give, as Michel said, meaningful information to experts. So you have to find the right balance to be fair. Voilà, it comes then to Rebecca's question about the drivers. So that's why we decided to issue a dedicated human rights report, to have a single document where you have all the information for meaningful information for our stakeholders. And we worked with Shift a long time, you know, to gather and to identify all our risks. So we disclose in this human rights report our salient human rights risks on human rights. So you have the list on the report, like in terms of child labor and forced labor in our value chain, in terms of discrimination, in terms of mental health, etc. I will not detail all the list, it's public, but just the journey and the drivers for us to do that was very important, because our stakeholders were asking us to do this in a single dedicated standalone document, of course, articulated to different pieces of existing reporting. We are not coming from scratch, articulated to vigilance, etc. But voilà, having something very accessible, easy to read, voilà, explaining how are we dealing and addressing all our salient risks was very important for our stakeholders. So that's why we decided to issue this dedicated report, and to be transparent and to respond to our stakeholders' expectations. And it was useful for us also to do this human rights report, because it helped us to have, let's say, collaboration approach with our sector, with our peers, with even more suppliers in different sectors, because we are using many raw materials or minerals, you know, to manufacture our beauty products in our plants. So we have a very complex sourcing, you know, all over the world. So this report was useful also in terms of collaboration with the different supply chains, let's say, that are complex and very different from one to another. And also, it's useful for us because it helped us in the CSRD and the CHRB. So having a dedicated human rights report is also helpful in terms of legal requirements. And another important driver is also that it helps to protect, in a way, our reputation, because it shows that we are quite mature on the problem. As Michelle said, we are not saying at all that we are perfect. We are aware of the risk, and we are saying that we have child labor and forced labor risk in our value chain, and try to explain what we can do to tackle some of them. But again, we are not yet there. So saying that is seen as a credible approach by many civil society actors. So it helped us also, and it was also one of the driver. Now, of course, there are some challenges, as Rebecca said. Of course, it's complex because human rights is such a broad topic in such a huge value chain. So to do a proper stakeholder consultation, as Michelle said, it's not easy. There is also a kind of fatigue from many stakeholders. So you have to be very strategic in the way you approach them. And to have done your homework. It's like, okay, guys, we have been working internally with our committee and with our experts, and we identify this list of issues. What do you think? And then it's easier for them to challenge you on existing work versus, oh, can you help us to do the job? So I agree with what Michelle said. It's very important to work internally first, do your homework, and then it's easier to ask feedback. So stakeholder consultation is still difficult again, because sometimes, of course, we have so many different stakeholders. They can contradict each other, so it's not always easy to take all the comments on board. So we have to be very strategic also to explain the rules, how you will proceed, how you will consult, what you can take. If you can't take it, you explain why. So again, it's such a complex process, so you don't have to underestimate that. But at the end, it's very, very useful. And in the human rights report, the first one we issued and we are talking about, we have put the list of stakeholders that have accepted to be mentioned. It's at the end of the report. And some of them didn't want at all to be mentioned. But of course, we respected that totally. And as Michelle said, some wanted to be compensated. Okay, if it's fair, because they are wasting a lot of time, why not? So voilà, we had different rules, but they were very clear prior the engagement. So for us, it was very insightful. But again, it's complex and it shouldn't be underestimated. Then other challenges, of course, there is a cost, and it's resource intensive and time intensive. So it has to be also taken into consideration and budgeted, because it takes a lot of time to do this report. It was several months, because we went in our different markets. You know, we have at least 70 markets, you know, and engaging with workshops, long workshops with different métiers at market level, as I said, from HR, from procurement, from marketing, from security, putting all these people together, explaining the frame, what the human rights, the UNGPs are about, and what Michelle said, what is severity, what is likelihood, and voilà, give all our people some useful tools so that they were able to work on the risk and assess and rank also these different risks, which is number one, number two, etc. So again, it takes time. It can be expensive, so it has to be anticipated prior you start that. Another challenge also, it's when you disclose your salient risks, it can increase your liability. So you have also to work with your lawyers, put them on board, and of course remind that there is also a legal frame to do that with the CSRD and CSRD coming. So again, it has to be prepared and weighted with your legal department. And then even sometimes if we wanted to be very specific and to share some very specific actions that we are taking to address such and such risks, sometimes you can't. There are some limitations, for example, in terms of security, to not expose, of course, your colleagues or your suppliers in a complex environment where you work. So there are also limitations to be taken on board, also for human rights reasons, by the way. So you can't disclose everything. Well, I think I answered your key questions, Rebecca. And at the end, of course, we are happy about this report. We received very positive feedback from civil society, from some investors that went through it, and from some UN agencies, and also from non-experts. So we were happy because it's not too long, it's not too short. We try to find a right balance to make it easy to read. So far so good, but again, it's a work in progress, and these risks are evolving. So.
Oh, thank you, Julie. That was really insightful, and thanks for kind of explaining that journey to us and also showing some of the complexities of what L'Oréal had to deal with and making these determinations when reporting. Also have a number of questions for you, and I'm sure folks do as well. So if you have questions, let's put those into the Q&A a while. And I'm going to hand it over to Danielle to give us a bit of the investor perspective on the importance of these types of human rights disclosures and what Robeco communicates to its portfolio companies. Thanks, Danielle, for being here today. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for the other two speakers to setting it up really well. So it's an easy task for me just to share the their investor perspective. Well, in my role within an active ownership team, and I see a lot of peers on the attendee list, so I think people know kind of about the role. So I engage companies on human rights issues, which mainly centers around the implementation of the UN guiding principles. And in that capacity, I read a lot of these reports. They're not always extensive and well prepared as the one L'Oréal was just presenting. And there are really different types of disclosures we know worldwide. So this can be indeed sustainability reports, this can be standalone reports, but also web-based disclosures. To be honest, anything works for an investor, preferably some data. But let me just give you first some highlights of what we in general terms see in practice. So I think overall we see more and more companies reporting about human rights commitment. But what I really find lagging is still the disclosure around their human rights due diligence and what they actually do with the findings of that. So I think that aligns nicely with the first speaker as well today. We do see many more companies hiring specific human rights expertise, thereby having more capacity to do this due diligence, and also really some work internally to strengthen their approaches, which I think is a good development. I also see that as really driven also by some of the regulatory developments that were pointed out today. And I think Michelle covered that pretty well, so I won't deep dive there. What I do want to say is that there's sometimes a bit of a misconception. Of course, I'm based in Europe, so for me, this is really top of mind, that all this European legislation actually also applies to some international companies, particularly if they have a certain amount of turnover in the EU. So actually the spread is much broader. And in my opinion, these regulatory developments are a positive, I think, for investors. It will increase disclosure on social issues, so we will have more to work with in the future. On the other hand, you will see also some legal risk, I think, for unprepared companies. So I think that's probably seen within the company group as a bit of a downside. And then how do we use that information? I think it's nice to touch upon both the engagement side, but also a bit of our own due diligence across our portfolio holdings. So let's first touch on engagement. I think how we work there is we really do bottom-up analysis. So we read the reports and we identify areas where we think the company can still improve, or also where we can complement them. Let's also not forget the positive angle. We regularly provide feedback on the reports. As I mentioned, due diligence is a key topic for us. We really feel that due diligence is an important tool for companies and investors to identify and assess risks in their business or portfolios. And when there's no reporting on this topic, we actually assume the worst, which is maybe a very negative sign, but we just don't know. So in the show us angle, we are really missing an important important information. It's a true gap for us. We also talk a lot about stakeholder engagement in the broadest sense of the word. So more just in general, how they're working with stakeholders, but really also as part of due diligence. Who are you consulting? What type of consultation do you do? And we kind of try to match that also with information we get from stakeholders in throughout public reports, let's say civil society reports, or hearing through those channels about affected stakeholders, and try to balance the two information sources and understand what is then really going on. We still see quite a lot of companies, particularly in certain markets, that are quite reluctant to discuss in detail their human rights approach, particularly in public reporting, but sometimes also through our dialogues. And we really tell those companies that we understand they're navigating really complex issues. And probably those nuances are not always easy to capture in just a report or a sentence or a piece of information. So I think those dialogues are also important as both, of course, with the stakeholders throughout the process, but also after the reporting is there. What does that mean, right? What if investors have more questions or other stakeholders? I think companies should be open for that type of dialogue as well. But we still see some challenges here and there. And I think another topic we really want to understand is how human rights are governed within an organization. So not only how do you identify those impacts, but also who's in the end responsible, right? Is this a human rights team? That is, of course, totally fine, but what is their mandate? Is there top-down support for their work? Can they stop a product development if they see it going in the wrong way? Those type of questions are also quite common for our engagement conversations. So, and while engagement really brings us the best insights, we only can do that from a limited set of companies. So we probably do that for about 250 to 300 companies a year across ESG, so not only on human rights. But we invest in many more companies. Those are more in a couple of thousands. So what we are also embarking, and it's maybe a bit similar as the story of L'Oreal, where you bring together a lot of key people that are dealing with this issue. Breaking down the silos a bit. I like that comment a lot. But we also set up a task force where we are assessing what is the best social data currently out there, which type of discussions can we have based on that, which type of conclusions can we draw. And we're building an internal system based on data provider data, but also some open source data, like the World Benchmarking Alliance data is one example. Some of the other benchmarks, but we're also trying to be a bit creative, so to go a little bit beyond the traditional data sources, to really ensure that we're not continuing to say social data or social reporting is not really good. We cannot do a lot with that, but actually to use what we have now and to think creatively how we can use that. Throughout that journey, I have to say there's much more data than we thought. It's very easy to say that data is not good, but once you actually get it internal and you start working with it, there is more insights we can gain from that. And as I said, throughout the regulatory developments, more data will become available. And I think for investors, it's really a key moment to start assessing what is available now, what will becoming available, but also what type of conclusions can you draw on that, right? What does it say if a company has no strikes? Well, as a single data point, maybe nothing, but what if they're in a market where there's also no freedom of association? Well, that tells you something, right? What about employee satisfaction? And you combine it with other data points. So that's sort of a data-driven approach we're taking internally, really to make sure we can do our own due diligence in a good way. Also, we are reporting in some of these regulatory developments, but also to get the best insights to our investment teams. And I see, despite some developments in the world, I do see also interest in understanding the S and ESG better. So maybe I'll leave it there to keep a couple of minutes for
Right, I know there's so much to cover, and there's just such a rich presentation. So thank you, and Danielle, also thank you very much for kind of demonstrating how an investor can actually sort of throw their hands up in the air and saying there's not enough S data, not enough human rights data to show how you can really tackle the issue, and what you see as some existing data and data we can expect now because of these regulatory developments. So if I can ask all the speakers to come back on camera, we do have a few minutes left, and folks, again, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Otherwise, I will take the privilege of asking questions because I've got so many after these presentations. But we do have a question from my colleague, David Schilling at ICCR. And this one is directed at you, Julie. He says, thanks for your presentation. Could you say a bit about the internal work to get legal counsel to understand the human rights focus on risk to people and not risk to the company? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for this very important question. We were helped to do that thanks to the French law on devoir de vigilance, because it's really stated clearly in the law that companies should assess risk to people. Still, even if it's clearly written, everybody tends to forget and going back to the usual reflex, say, okay, we will assess risk to business. So my tip was saying, okay, if we are having risk to people, it will have risk to business. So everybody agrees on that, and it helped a lot. And yeah, also now we are also helped with all this European legislation and the other laws Michelle mentioned, in the US with the WRO, etc. Again, they are targeting specific human rights risks like forced labor, etc. It's really risk on people. So more and more now they understand legal come to this, but because it's not easy, because most of them are not human rights experts. So you have to raise awareness, educate, explain. At the end, it's manageable, but it takes time also.
Thank you, Julie. And we just have 2 minutes left. I don't see other questions. I'm going to take the prerogative. Quick question to you, Michelle, picking up on what Julie was just saying about some of the legal developments. You had talked about the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And it's my understanding that the disclosures that companies need to make under the CSRD on due diligence are covered by the disclosures they're doing under the CSRD. But the CSRD is a disclosure standard where the CSRD is a standard of conduct. And just maybe if you could, in just a few, very briefly, tell us, is that sufficient? Is disclosure under the CSRD sufficient to meet, in your mind, what's required for disclosures under the UN Guiding Principles?
Absolutely. So we worked very hard. I was personally involved in drafting the social standards, for those familiar, S1 to S4 in the CSRD ESRS. And the alignment with the UNGPs is very good. So not only, I think if you are looking to report against or you have to report against the CSRD, you are going to tackle most of your UNGPs questions. They're there. It's the same process of prioritization for impact materiality. I would say that's great. And it's also a full value chain approach where the CSRD is a reduced scope. It doesn't cover, some elements of downstream value chain. So it really gives you this holistic view that the CSRD from a political, compromise could not get that full value chain. So I would say, yes, absolutely. Great alignment and a great tool is including looking at business model risk, elevating social issues to governing bodies. So absolutely.
Okay, great, fantastic. And then one quick question to you, Danielle. In your interactions with companies, are they prepared? CSRD, CSRD coming down the pike. I mean, CSRD obviously has to be transposed first. It's going to be a couple of years till it fully kicks in. But are companies getting ready? Or do you see them going down that route to prepare?
Yeah, for sure. But it takes a lot of capacity on their end. So I'm talking to companies and they're feeling the pressure to do this. Some companies have been prepared already really well. As Michelle just pointed out, some of these things are really not new, right? The UNGPs have been there for many, many years. So there's really companies that can do that relatively easy. I think the skill and scope of some of the operations makes it complex, but I see a lot of companies working on this, of course.
And if I can just respond to this, I agree.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to say, right now we're hearing of over-implementation of the CSRD, pressure to reduce the number of disclosures. There is really this risk of over-implementation. We're seeing it. Companies are going too far in trying to figure this out, where scaling it back would actually respond to, you know, the CSRD and really give you know, users of sustainability disclosures a good view of risk. So I think that there's a you know, some real concerns here that it is a burden, and by focusing on what matters most, you can make this manageable.
And that very much is in line with what Julie was saying about finding that right balance of disclosures. Well, we're at time. I want to thank all three of you. This has been a tremendously informative discussion. For all of those of you who are still online, we will have this presentation publicly shared along with the slides. Thank you so much, and we look forward to continuing this conversation. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.